Hello everyone. Today we're going to talk about the features of the human brain. The human brain has two hemispheres. We've got the left cerebral hemisphere and the right cerebral hemisphere. There's a fissure in between those two hemispheres known as the longitudinal fissure. The brain has different lobes. We've got the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, occipital, and on the side we have the temporal lobe. Those squiggly parts right there are known as gyri, and the singular term for gyri would be a gyrus. In between those gyri, there are these grooves where blood vessels would reside in there, and those grooves are known as sulci, and the singular term for sulci would be sulcus. There is a sulcus that divides the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, and this sulcus right here is known as the central sulcus. The gyrus in front of the central sulcus is known as the precentral gyrus, and the gyrus after the central sulcus is known as the postcentral gyrus. So we've got the frontal lobe right here, the parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. Right here, sitting underneath the brain, is the cerebellum, which helps with our balance. And in between the cerebrum, which is the brain, the cerebrum, and the cerebellum, there is a fissure known as the transverse fissure, or you can refer to it as the transverse cerebral fissure. If we cut a piece of the brain and look inside, we would find two regions. This superficial region, which is usually going to be brownish in color, we refer to it as the gray matter, or we refer to it as the cortex. And this deeper area right here, which is going to be much lighter in color, we refer to it as the white matter. The brainstem consists of three parts. We've got the midbrain, we've got the pons, and the medulla oblongata. This diencephalon region right here is where we're going to have our thalamus and our hypothalamus. There are hollow cavities inside of the brain known as ventricles, and those ventricles is where the CSF or the cerebral spinal fluid resides. The cerebral spinal fluid can move from one ventricle to another. Those two ventricles right here that look like the letter C, one in each hemisphere, those are known as the lateral ventricles. The CSF moves from the lateral ventricle and enters into the third ventricle. So the third ventricle is right here. Then the CSF moves from the third ventricle, goes down that canal known as the cerebral aqueduct, and it moves into the fourth ventricle. The CSF can also exit the fourth ventricle through these tiny holes right there, and the CSF can actually surround the whole entire brain from the outside. So the three ventricles are the lateral ventricle, the third ventricle, and the fourth ventricle. Let's take a look at this medial view of the brain. We would find the frontal lobe right here, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Now we know that the brain has two hemispheres, the left and right cerebral hemisphere, and what holds those two hemispheres together is this region right here known as the corpus callosum. Right here, this is where we would find our lateral ventricle, in this region right there. Right here, this is where we would have our third ventricle. And right in front of the cerebellum, we would have our fourth ventricle. This canal right here is the cerebral aqueduct. So the CSF moves from the third ventricle down the cerebral aqueduct into the fourth ventricle. That pink stuff that you see right here in the third ventricle is known as the choroid plexus. And the choroid plexus is actually found in the other ventricles as well, not just in the third ventricle. The choroid plexus is what helps make the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid. In this region right here, this is where we would have the thalamus. Right below the thalamus, we have the hypothalamus. Hypo means below. Connected to the hypothalamus, we would have the pituitary gland. And there's actually another gland back here known as the pineal gland. And this is the one that makes melatonin, the chemical that helps you go to sleep. The three regions for the brainstem, we've got the midbrain, we've got the pons, and the medulla oblongata. The cerebellum also has the gray matter and the white matter. So this kind of brownish region would be the gray matter, and the white matter for the cerebellum looks like tree branches. That's why we refer to the white matter of the cerebellum as arbor vitae, because arbor means tree. So this is another image showing you the ventricle. So notice how the ventricle, as I said, it's a hollow cavity. So you can have a better view of the lateral ventricle in there. And one more time, this would be the corpus callosum, and in here would be the lateral ventricle. That's a zoomed in image for the cerebellum. So this is how the cerebellum looks like. The cerebellum also has two hemispheres. We refer to them as the cerebellar hemispheres. In between those two hemispheres, or you can think of it as what's holding them together, is a region known as the vermis. Those folded parts right there, or crevices, we refer to them as folia. And if you cut it open, so you have a mid-sagittal view right here, you would see the gray matter of the cerebellum, and you would see those arbor vitae, the white matter of the cerebellum. And right in front of it, there is the fourth ventricle. And right here, this canal would be the cerebral aqueduct. And you can also see the three parts of the brainstem. We've got the midbrain, we've got the pons, and we've got the medulla oblongata. There are 12 cranial nerves. The first cranial nerve we're going to talk about is the olfactory nerve, which helps detect smell. The olfactory nerve has this region right here, known as the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract. And the olfactory nerve is right on top of our nasal cavity. The second cranial nerve is the optic nerve, which crisscrosses right there. This optic nerve helps with sight, and when it crisscrosses like this, we refer to it as chiasm. Chiasm meaning cross. This region right here is the midbrain, and this stalk right here known as the infundibulum, this is where the pituitary gland would sit. Right here, right below the midbrain, kind of right above the pons, we've got the third cranial nerve known as the oculomotor nerve, which helps moves movement of the eyes and the pupil. On the side of the pons, we've got the fourth nerve, which is the trochlear nerve, helps with the movement of the eyes. The trigeminal nerve is going to be for face sensation. Then we've got our abducens nerve right here, which help move the eyes. Then we've got our facial nerve, which helps us move our face and salivate. Then we've got our vestibulocochlear nerve, and that one is for hearing and balance. This one right here is the glossopharyngeal nerve, and it's for tasting and swallowing. Then we've got our vagus nerve, and this one is actually our longest cranial nerve, and it runs all the way from our brainstem all the way to our colon, and it can stimulate so many things like the muscles in our heart. It can stimulate involuntary contraction in our digestive tract, in our stomach, in our esophagus. So it plays a role in our autonomic nervous system, the part that we don't really have conscious control over. Then we've got this nerve right here known as the accessory nerve, and this one helps with the movement of our heads. Then we've got the last cranial nerve, so cranial nerve number 12, and that one is the hypoglossal nerve, which helps with the movement of the tongue.